One of the things people like to do at Christmas time is open photo albums. And as you go back in photo albums, you'll take a look at certain pictures, and they'll remind you of particular events in someone's life. Most people don't have photo albums that cover every event, although if you've ever been invited to someone's house when they've been on a trip for the 2,000 slide show, you know exactly. I mean, 3 hours later, if you haven't fallen asleep, they're still telling you about how great the trip was with more photos. Or in the modern generation, they'd be selfie pictures, not pictures of the area, but always the person in it with the thing behind. And so we have these photo albums that remind us of things. And some people have, and I encountered this recently, a tree where each of the decorations on the tree represents something. Some families give a decoration to each member of the family at Christmas time, and they hang them up. And so depending on the year, you can go back and think, oh, that's from 10 years ago, or that's when X was X. And so they represent memories. I wanted to give that as sort of the introduction to understanding our gospel reading this morning. We have 4 gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of them is written to a different community. For example, Matthew is written to a predominantly Jewish community. And so if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, you'll find a lot of texts from the Old Testament. Anytime he's talking about theological principles, he'll automatically go back to the Old Testament. In Luke's Gospel, scholars tell us it's written predominantly to Jews in the diaspora and to non-Jews, Gentiles. And so in Luke's Gospel, anytime Luke mentions a Jewish practice, he'll often explain it. Now, of course, if you're Jewish, you wouldn't have to explain. You know what the particular event, the Passover, was, and so on and so on. In Luke's Gospel, he takes particular attention to explain a text or explain a practice so that non-Jews could understand the significance of it. This is important in understanding Luke's Gospel because Luke has a number of snapshots or pictures of Jesus' life, and he assembles it in a particular order to communicate who Jesus is to the audience he's writing to. That's why we have 4 Gospels, and each of the 4 Gospels is unique. It's communicating who Jesus is to a particular community, and therefore some stories are in some Gospels, but not in others. And sometimes the order is different. It doesn't make them untrue, it just means that the way the Gospel writer is assembling the material is to make a point, pointing to who Jesus is. It's like a photo album. There's a particular, I can't remember what you call it, but you go to Michael's store and you buy products to create a page, and then you put pictures. What do you call it? Scrapbooking, thank you. Very popular. You organize the picture and the items on the page to tell a story, right? That is a great illustration of the purpose of the Gospels. Now, just for your information, there are about 72 other books or more that did not make it into the canon of the New Testament. Things you probably never heard of. For example, in the early church, as people came to faith in Christ, they wanted to know more about Jesus' early life. And by the way, coming from a Gentile background, particularly in a Hellenistic culture, remember Alexander the Great conquering all of the Middle East and introducing Greek culture? It still affects us today. You may or may not realize it, but you actually are Greek thinkers. Affected by the Renaissance, but also by Hellenistic thought. It's a very particular way of analyzing what truth is. And one of the interesting elements of Hellenistic culture was that someone's greatness could be seen early in their life. For example, the gods or goddesses often would have an amazing youth before they achieved fullness of their power in adulthood. One of the reasons Luke probably includes a few stories of Jesus' early life is it would have meant something to his Gentile audience. It's saying, look at how Jesus acts in his early life, and it points towards who he's going to be as an adult. It would have meant something in their context. But there are many stories, for example, the Arab Gospel or the infancy gospel of St. Thomas. You've probably never heard of these texts. They're called Gnostic texts. They're part of a body of literature that was written after the New Testament by people who claimed to have known the disciples, but never received authenticity or acceptance in the early church, because the Gospels and the New Testament texts were written by people who knew Jesus, were a follower of Jesus, or new followers of Jesus, like the Apostle Paul. So in Luke's Gospel, Luke takes careful note and he speaks to Mary to find out stories about what was Jesus like as he was growing up. And we know that those stories likely come from Mary, particularly this one this morning, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But it's important for you to know that there are a whole series of other books that were never accepted into the New Testament, and for a very good reason. They couldn't have authenticity because they didn't know who wrote them. Number two, some of the stories are really strange and inconsistent with what we know of Jesus in the Gospels. For example, in the infancy Gospel of St. Thomas, Jesus as a child curses another child and withers his hand after that child breaks the dam that Jesus was playing with in the mud. Now, this doesn't sound like Jesus, and that's exactly what the early church thought. So you had a whole series of texts that were never accepted, but every once in a while you'll hear them referenced in the secular press. But the early church was very definitive about accepting what had authority and what did not about the life of Jesus. So the four Gospels have authority because they go back to the earliest witnesses of Jesus' life, and we know that they carry weight and gravitas, regardless of what the Toronto Star said about Jesus on Christmas Eve, if you read the editorial. For example, the Apostle Paul writes about the resurrection of Christ 11 years after it happens. His earliest letter is probably 42 AD. Jesus is probably crucified in 33. So 11 years later, we have his first letter talking about the resurrected Christ. That was not mentioned in the Toronto Star article, strangely. But if you don't know the history, you would maybe get a very different understanding of the authenticity of the texts. So we have some of the recollections of Jesus' early life. There are not many included because the gospel writers wanted to concentrate on the last 3 years of his ministry, and in particular, the last week of his ministry, the Passover in Jerusalem to his crucifixion and resurrection. That's the main focus of the four Gospels. But Mary treasured things in her heart. Luke tells us that she kept these stories. And anybody who's been a parent, have you lost a child? If you probably remember it like it's yesterday. In my case, I didn't lose a child. I was the lost child. How many of you remember Simpsons and Eaton's toy departments? I got lost. I don't know if I should be boasting about this. I got lost in the Eaton's Simpsons toy department. And of course, I was shorter at that time and you see, I came from a poorer family, so we could never afford to buy a lot of the toys that they had on display there. But if you wanted the toy department, you could play with them for free. Well, the ones that they had the train sets and things like that out. Fortunately, store security found me eventually, but I remember my mother was rightfully paranoid about where's her son in the middle of this giant department store. Now, in case you think you're the only person to have done this, let me tell you the story from former Prime Minister Cameron in England. They were at a pub, and as reported, one of their children, Nancy, went to the bathroom. Meanwhile, the rest of the family piled into the two cars with security detail and left. They forgot Nancy was in the bathroom. And both of them thought that Nancy was in the other vehicle of the two. It was only when they got to their home in London they realized she wasn't there. Now, if you can miss a child with a security detail as the Prime Minister of England, it can happen to anybody. So it's okay. Point being, that's a modern illustration of Luke chapter 2. But you've got to understand something about pilgrimages to Jerusalem. In Jesus' day, the road between Nazareth and Jerusalem was a very dangerous place. You had, as you do in many parts of the world today, and I want to put it in context, think Somalia or Yemen or some other places I can think of where you would not go out at night because there are groups of people waiting to rob you, or worse. Remember the parable of the Good Samaritan? What happens to him when he's alone leaving Jerusalem on the way to Jericho? Robbers set on him and virtually kill him. And by the way, that was common practice. You kill the witness. Nobody's going to testify against you. So you rob them, you kill them. And so one of the defenses against this was to travel in caravans of pilgrimage people, usually from the same place. Now, Nazareth at the time of Jesus probably had about 50 families. It was a small town. They've just uncovered one of the houses in 2009 from that time period. And just to give you an idea of the times, the houses were actually camouflaged, so not easily seen, because the times they were living in were very dangerous for a whole series of reasons. And so when you travel from the feast of the Passover in Jerusalem back to Nazareth, you went in a very long convoy with men with swords at the front, men with swords at the back, and women and children and the vulnerable, the older folk, in the center. And you would have extended families. As a result, they weren't sure where Jesus was. He could have been at the front with Joseph. He could have been at the back with another relative, or he could have actually been walking with the children in the center as well. It's only one day into the return trip back to Nazareth, they discover he's not with the relatives. Have you ever had that experience when you've lost someone? When it strikes, he's not there. They panic. They've just gone from a festival which probably had 1 million people at least in a city, and you're going back to a small community with 50 families. You see the difference? Can you imagine the paranoia and fear of having your 12-year-old left in that place, the city? And so they head back to Jerusalem and they start looking around to all the places they've gone. Have you lost keys or done something like that? Your wallet. We had someone leave their whole purse here on Christmas Eve. Fortunately, they had their phone number and ID, so two of us opened the purse and we called the number, and then I heard a ringing sound. Because they had left their cell phone in their purse. And yes, I was dialing the right number. I eventually found the person and they came back for all's well, nothing disappeared. But the feeling of paranoia when I found out, my whole purse, all my ID is gone. And so Mary and Joseph rush back to Jerusalem and start retracing their steps, all the places they've gone. Eventually they get to the temple. Now the temple's a big place. And as they enter it, they find Jesus sitting with a group of scholars. And I've always wondered, could one of those people have been Joseph of Arimathea? Or could there have been someone called Nicodemus, a younger Nicodemus? Interesting question. Jesus is there listening and asking questions with a real hunger and a maturity. Now, why does Luke include this story? It's because it points to the reality of who Jesus is. Because Jesus' response here is, I'm here in my Father's house. Who's his Father? God. And it's pointing to his love of the Scriptures, his love of the Lord, where his life is moving, the journey. It's not about disobedience of his parents or anything like that. And that's a modern reading of it. It's about faithfulness, and that's why Luke includes the story. If anything, I think Mary and Joseph were probably the two who were embarrassed. It's losing your kids, home alone, embarrassment. But this story is about the faithfulness of Jesus, even at the early age, of discovering his full identity as Son of God. his love of the scriptures, his love of worship. And that's why it's included as part of the Gospel of Luke, part of the story. But I want to leave you with two other interesting thoughts. There's a 3-day period here. The 3 days comes up frequently in the scriptures. The time between the crucifixion and resurrection, 3 days. Think of the number of times threes come up. Lazarus' death and resurrection, 3 days. There's this really interesting time period of 3 as it continually happens. The second thing is the connection with the Passover. Here Jesus is in the temple learning about the scriptures. He's going to be in that same place later where he's rejected and cast aside and crucified. So there are a lot of really interesting parallels yet to come, foreshadowing of what's to happen. God's love for us is at the heart of the text. Yeah. May God bless you and keep you. Amen.